June 14th, 1992, 2:47 a.m. A basement in Cicero, Illinois, 40 miles west of downtown Chicago. The fluorescent lights hum, concrete walls, a single metal chair bolted to the floor, blood pooling beneath it, still wet. Neal Kalayjian, 28 years old, nephew of a cocaine empire worth $50 million, has been missing for 6 hours. By dawn, he will be found, not whole. His cousins had built something extraordinary in the 1980s. Not outfit made guys too close to the old guard, not street hustlers. They were something new. Legitimate businessmen who moved cocaine through Los Angeles, then Arizona, then back to Chicago. They moved 30 kilos a week. They paid for houses in cash. They drove German cars through suburbs that asked no questions, until they made a choice that would transform them from invisible operators into targets, until they crossed someone who could not be crossed, until their own blood became leverage. This is not a story about drug dealers. This is a story about what happens when ambition collides with a hierarchy older than the enterprise itself. When family becomes liability, when loyalty becomes execution. The Kalayjian name arrived in America like thousands of others carrying nothing but ambition and survival instinct. 1923, a family fleeing the Armenian genocide, the systematic elimination that would kill 1.5 million. They carried trauma in their DNA. Rafi Kalayjian, the patriarch, settled in Los Angeles. He started small, produced distribution, the kind of work that required no capital, only hustle. By 1945, he owned a grocery wholesaler. By 1955, he had expanded to 3 cities. Legitimate, clean, respectable. This was the family mythology. This was what allowed them to move through American society without suspicion. But mythology and reality diverged sharply when his sons came of age. Rafi Jr. and his cousins inherited the business infrastructure but not the immigrants' gratitude for legitimacy. They were born in America. They saw opportunity differently. By 1978, they understood something their father never would. The grocery distribution network was perfect cover for something more profitable. They began small. Cocaine moving through the same channels as produce, hidden in shipment manifests, protected by the legitimacy of the family business. No one questioned a truck from Kalayjian Wholesale. Neal Kalayjian entered this world in 1964, the youngest, quiet, observant. By his mid-20s, he had become the enforcer, the one who ensured discipline within the network, who collected from dealers, who represented the family in negotiations. He was not flashy. He did not draw attention. This was his fatal strength and his ultimate weakness. The Chicago outfit in 1980 operated under a principle older than the Republic itself, territorial monopoly. Every neighborhood had an overseer. Every operation, legitimate or criminal, paid tribute. The system was rigid. It was also profitable beyond measure. The Kalayjians understood this the moment they decided to expand eastward from Los Angeles. They were not made men. They would never be made men. The outfit did not induct outsiders, particularly not Armenians with no blood connection to the founding families. But what they lacked in membership, they compensated for with utility. They had logistics. They had discipline. They had cocaine. By 1982, they had established contact with a specific outfit faction, mid-level operators who controlled distribution in 3 neighborhoods on Chicago's west side. The arrangement was transactional. The Kalayjians would supply high-quality cocaine at competitive prices. The outfit would provide protection and distribution channels. Everyone profited. The outfit hierarchy received their tax, a percentage of every transaction. This worked because it was invisible. Between 1982 and 1988, the operation expanded methodically. Shipments arrived monthly. Dealers multiplied. Money moved backward through seemingly legitimate business transactions, wire transfers, cash deposits, property purchases. The Kalayjians purchased a nightclub in Chicago. They bought a restaurant. They invested in real estate. To external observers, they were entrepreneurs. To federal investigators, they were becoming a problem. By 1989, the operation moved 30 kilos weekly through the Chicago market alone. That was $15 million monthly. The Kalayjians' cut was substantial enough to fund a lifestyle that began attracting attention. Expensive cars, new homes, jewelry, more dangerously, confidence. They had succeeded for 7 years without arrest, without significant law enforcement pressure, without internal betrayal. Success breeds a particular type of blindness. It whispers that the rules which constrain others do not constrain you. That competence and scale create immunity. The outfit was watching this blindness develop. They were preparing to correct it. Every criminal enterprise contains a point where expansion becomes transgression. For the Kalayjians, that point arrived in late 1990. The decision was rational by their logic. Their network in Chicago was saturated. Distribution channels were maxed. To grow further, they needed to expand into new territory. Phoenix, Arizona, offered opportunity, a growing city with weak outfit presence, high cocaine demand, and minimal organized crime infrastructure. They began moving product through Phoenix without formal permission. This was the violation. The outfit's power rested not on military dominance but on monopoly control. Every operation, every dealer, every transaction required authorization. This was not cruelty, it was business structure. The outfit did not care who made money. The outfit cared that everyone knew who controlled the mechanism. The Kalayjians' Phoenix expansion signaled something dangerous. The possibility that competent operators could function outside the permission structure. If one family could do it, others would try. The system would fracture. A complaint moved up the hierarchy, then another. By early 1991, outfit leadership initiated a meeting. The Kalayjians were summoned to negotiate. The message was clear: cease the unauthorized expansion, pay a larger tribute, accept that growth had limits. The Kalayjians refused. This was arrogance disguised as principle. They argued they were generating unprecedented profits. They argued the outfit's cut was already substantial. They argued they had built something through competence and should not be constrained by rigid territorial rules written decades earlier. Leadership did not debate these points. They simply decided the problem would be eliminated. By March 1991, the decision was made. The Kalayjians would be dismantled. Not immediately, that would be messy, but systematically, surgically. Neal Kalayjian would be the first casualty. He was the enforcer. He was the most visible. He was also the most isolated, younger than his cousins, less deeply connected to legitimate business operations, more vulnerable. The execution was already being planned, while he still believed negotiation remained possible. In 1991, the federal government was not simply investigating organized crime, it was executing a coordinated strategy of annihilation. The RICO Act, passed in 1970, had transformed criminal prosecution. Previously, the outfit operated with relative impunity because individual dealers could be arrested without touching leadership. RICO changed this calculus. It allowed prosecutors to target entire criminal enterprises, to prove conspiracy, to hold leadership accountable for the actions of subordinates. By 1991, the FBI had penetrated multiple outfit operations. Wiretaps ran constantly. Informants were embedded throughout the hierarchy. The pressure on leadership was unprecedented. This context is crucial. The outfit did not execute the Kalayjians merely because of their Phoenix expansion. They executed them because the organization itself was under existential threat from federal prosecution. Leadership needed to demonstrate control. They needed to show that they could police their own organization, eliminate problems, maintain discipline. An independent operator moving product without authorization, while federal agents were actively building RICO cases, represented something worse than simple transgression. It represented weakness. The DEA had been tracking the Kalayjian network since 1989. Surveillance photographs documented shipments. Wiretaps recorded transactions. By mid-1991, federal prosecutors were preparing charges against multiple family members. The outfit leadership knew this timeline. They understood that the Kalayjians would face federal pressure soon, the kind of pressure that turns cooperating witnesses into government assets. Better to eliminate them first. Better to execute them before they could cut a deal. Better to demonstrate to every other operator that independence carried a terminal cost. The decision to execute Neal Kalayjian was not merely a response to his specific transgression. It was a political statement made by an organization fighting for survival against federal prosecution. His death would serve multiple purposes simultaneously: eliminate a liability, intimidate potential cooperators, demonstrate outfit power when that power was visibly eroding. The execution required precision. The Kalayjians operated as a coordinated unit. Neal could not simply disappear without the others immediately mobilizing, contacting lawyers, fleeing, creating chaos that would complicate the outfit's subsequent moves against the rest of the family. The solution was psychological isolation layered with false promise. In May 1992, Neal received a message. A meeting had been arranged with outfit leadership to resolve the Phoenix dispute. Not a confrontation, a negotiation. The tone was conciliatory. The message suggested that cooler heads prevailed, that compromise was possible. Neal informed his cousins. They were relieved. They believed the worst had passed. This belief was the mechanism of isolation. While Neal prepared for negotiation, his cousins remained in their homes, their businesses, their normal routines. They were not warned. They were not told to prepare for flight. They continued operating as though the conflict was being resolved through dialogue. The outfit had identified a specific location, a basement in Cicero controlled by a trusted lieutenant. Neutral ground, safe space. The kind of location where sensitive meetings occurred regularly. On June 14, 1992, Neal was summoned. He arrived expecting discussion. He found execution. But before death, there was interrogation. The outfit needed information. Where was the hidden money? How many legitimate businesses held Kalayjian assets? What did federal investigators already know? Who else within the organization might be planning independent operations? Neal was tortured for intelligence, not merely for punishment. The brutality served function. His cousins, still unaware, remained accessible. His isolated death would shock them into confusion, the optimal state for making poor decisions, for accepting deals, for failing to mount effective legal defense. The isolation of one man created the vulnerability of the entire family. The basement in Cicero was unremarkable. Cinderblock walls painted industrial gray. Bare concrete floor. A single metal chair, bolted permanently to the ground, installed years earlier for precisely this purpose. Neal Kalayjian arrived at 8:15 p.m. on June 14, 1992. 3 men were waiting. He was not immediately restrained. The first moments were designed to preserve the illusion of negotiation. They offered him a seat. They spoke in measured tones. They explained that the Phoenix operation represented a serious violation of protocol. They explained that the outfit leadership had decided consequences were necessary. It was during this explanation that Neal understood. The moment of realization, the instant when he comprehended that this was not negotiation but execution, lasted perhaps 3 seconds. His body language shifted. He moved toward the door. The 3 men did not move quickly. They did not need to. The door was locked. The basement had no windows. There was nowhere to go. He was restrained. The chair. Zip ties around his wrists and ankles. The interrogation began immediately. The questions were specific. Bank account locations, property titles, the names of every dealer in the network, the extent of federal investigation knowledge. Neal refused initially. The refusal lasted approximately 20 minutes. Physical torture is documented by forensic evidence. The medical examiner's report, filed after discovery of the body, noted blunt force trauma to the face, ribs, and abdomen, lacerations consistent with sharp instruments, burns consistent with cigarette application. The pattern suggested prolonged interrogation hours of escalating violence designed to extract information, not to kill quickly. Neal eventually provided information: names, locations, account numbers. Once the interrogation was complete, the execution became inevitable. The method chosen was strangulation, practical, clean, leaving minimal forensic evidence compared to gunshot wounds. The killer identity, never conclusively established, applied a ligature around Neal's neck. The chair remained bolted to the floor. The body did not move. The entire operation took approximately 4 hours from arrival to death. Neal Kalayjian was 28 years old. He had been in the family business for less than 5 years. He had never testified against anyone. He had never cooperated with law enforcement. He died because his cousins had miscalculated, and because the outfit needed to demonstrate the cost of miscalculation to every other operator watching. Neal's body was discovered in the basement on June 15th at 2:47 a.m. by construction workers who had been given the keys to the location. The discovery was not accidental. The outfit ensured the body would be found quickly. The message needed to circulate. The Chicago Police Department initially treated it as a standard homicide. No immediate connection to organized crime was made. But within 48 hours, federal investigators recognized the pattern: the basement, the torture, the execution method. This was outfit discipline. The body's discovery triggered immediate panic within the Kalayjian family. His cousins understood instantly that negotiation had been a fiction. They understood that they were next. The federal government, simultaneously, accelerated prosecution. The Kalayjians, suddenly vulnerable, suddenly facing both outfit execution and federal prosecution, became cooperative witnesses. Plea deals were negotiated rapidly. Rafi Jr. agreed to testify. Other cousins followed. By September 1992, indictments were filed. The Kalayjian cocaine network was dismantled. Distribution channels collapsed. Dealers arrested or fled. The $50 million empire ceased to exist within 90 days of Neal's death. But the broader impact extended beyond one family. Every independent operator in the Midwest received the message. Expansion without authorization resulted in execution. The Kalayjian case became legendary within criminal circles, the example cited whenever ambitious operators considered operating outside outfit permission. The organization had successfully communicated absolute power through a single death. Neal became the enforcer's enforcer, his execution the mechanism by which the outfit maintained control over a fragmenting criminal enterprise during the final years of its dominance. Neal Kalayjian's death reveals a fundamental truth about organized crime hierarchies. They do not eliminate competition, they eliminate presumption. The Kalayjians possessed competence, capital, and operational discipline. These were not sufficient. What they lacked was deference, the acknowledgement that power flows from permission, not from performance. The basement in Cicero becomes symbolic. That concrete room, that metal chair, that ligature, they represent the mechanism by which hierarchies maintain themselves. Not through law, not through legitimacy. Through the demonstration that violation carries an absolute cost. 28 years old, never testified, never betrayed anyone, still executed. This was the message. The outfit was collapsing. Federal prosecution was dismantling it. Its power was eroding across every front. Yet in its final years of dominance, it summoned enough authority to execute a man for the crime of ambition. We return to that basement. We imagine the silence after death. The fluorescent lights humming. The blood pooling on concrete, a body still warm, zip-tied to a chair. This is what hierarchy costs. Not money, not years in prison. Blood, the understanding that you operate only because permission was granted. That permission can be revoked. That revocation carries no appeal. Neal Kalayjian was not a martyr. He was a message, and every criminal in America received it.